The Cleveland Browns already made their decision. They just haven't said it out loud yet. And if you've really been paying attention, not just to the headlines, but to the tone, the coverage, the subtle shifts in how people inside that building are talking, you can feel it. Something has changed. Not in a loud, headline-grabbing way, but in that quiet, calculated way organizations operate when they're trying to move on from a situation without creating immediate backlash. Because while everyone keeps debating Deshaun Watson's future, and while Shedeur Sanders continues to dominate the conversation as the next guy up, there's one name that has almost completely vanished from relevance. A quarterback who, not that long ago, was supposed to be part of this team's future has now become an afterthought in real time. Dillon Gabriel isn't being criticized, he isn't being defended, he's just not being talked about at all. And in the NFL, that kind of silence speaks louder than any press conference ever could. Think about it for a second. In a league where every rep, every throw, every minor update gets dissected and debated across multiple platforms, how does a young quarterback, someone who started games, someone who was once viewed as a legitimate piece of the puzzle, suddenly disappear from the narrative completely? No real breakdowns of his development, no strong endorsements from the coaching staff, no push from the front office trying to keep his name in the mix. Instead, what you're seeing is a very deliberate shift in attention. Every conversation circles back to Sanders, every financial discussion ties back to Watson, every rumor about the future involves someone who isn't Gabriel. And when that happens consistently, day after day, it stops being coincidence and starts looking like strategy. Because teams don't accidentally forget to talk about quarterbacks they believe in. That's not how this works. And here's where it gets even more telling. This isn't just about media narratives or fan speculation. This is about organizational behavior. The Browns are moving like a team that already knows what its quarterback room is going to look like. They're just not ready to fully reveal it yet. They're laying the groundwork, slowly shifting expectations, making sure that when the move finally happens, it feels inevitable instead of shocking. And in that kind of setup, someone like Dillon Gabriel doesn't get a dramatic send-off. There's no big announcement, no emotional goodbye, just a quiet transition from part of the conversation to barely mentioned at all. It's subtle, but it's incredibly revealing. Because the truth is, this situation was never as open as it was made to seem. The idea of a wide-open quarterback competition, of multiple players battling it out on equal footing, that sounds great on paper and it plays well publicly, but behind the scenes, decisions like this are rarely that uncertain. There are always preferences, there are always internal evaluations that carry more weight than anything said to the media. And when you line up everything we've seen over the past few weeks, the financial moves, the reporting, the shift in focus, it starts to paint a very clear picture. Not just about where Dillon Gabriel stands, but about what the Browns are really trying to build moving forward. So the question isn't just whether Gabriel is on his way out, because at this point, that almost feels like a formality. The real question is why it feels like he was never truly given a path to stay in the first place. And once you start looking at it from that angle, once you stop focusing on what's being said and start paying attention to what's being avoided, the entire situation starts to look very different. And the clearest sign that something is off doesn't come from a headline, a breaking report, or even a leaked conversation. It comes from the silence. Over the past few weeks, as the Browns have spoken publicly about their quarterback situation, there's been a very noticeable pattern in how those conversations unfold. Deshaun Watson gets discussed in detail, whether it's about his recovery, his contract, or what his role might look like moving forward. Shedeur Sanders gets even more attention, with constant talk about his development, his upside, and how the team plans to build around him. But when it comes to Dillon Gabriel, the conversation doesn't just shrink, it almost disappears entirely. And in a situation where three quarterbacks are supposedly part of the same competition, that kind of imbalance doesn't happen by accident. What makes it even more telling is how quickly the organization pivots whenever Gabriel's name comes up. There might be a brief, surface-level comment about him continuing to develop or working hard behind the scenes, but it never goes deeper than that. There's no real conviction behind it, no detailed breakdown of what he's improving, no indication that the team is seriously considering him as part of the long-term picture. Instead, those mentions feel more like obligations, lines that need to be said rather than beliefs that are actually held. And almost immediately, the focus shifts right back to Sanders or right back to Watson, as if that's where the real story is meant to stay.
Over time, that kind of pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Even the local media, the people closest to the team who usually pick up on every subtle shift, have started reflecting that same energy. Conversations that should logically include Gabriel barely acknowledge him. Debates about the future of the quarterback room are framed almost entirely around 2 names, not 3. And when analysts or insiders do break things down, Gabriel is often mentioned as an afterthought, if he's mentioned at all. That's not just a coincidence or a random oversight. That's a reflection of the information they're getting, directly or indirectly, from inside the building. Because when a team truly believes a player is part of the plan, that belief finds its way into the coverage. It gets reinforced, repeated, and expanded on. What we're seeing is the opposite.
And that's why this silence matters so much. In the NFL, teams don't always tell you exactly what they're going to do, but they almost always show you. It's in how they allocate attention, how they frame their messaging, and how consistently certain names stay in the spotlight while others fade into the background. Right now, Dillon Gabriel isn't just being overlooked, he's being quietly removed from the narrative altogether. And when that happens this early in the offseason, before competitions even begin, it sends a very clear message about where things are heading. Because if this were truly an open competition, if Gabriel were genuinely viewed as someone who could win the job or even firmly secure a role, you would hear it, you would feel it. There would be urgency in how his name is discussed, detail in how his progress is described, and consistency in how he's included in every major conversation about the position. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening is something far more subtle and far more revealing. The Browns aren't debating Dillon Gabriel's future, they've already decided it. They're just letting the rest of the world catch up on their own timeline. And once you recognize that, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly pushed them to that decision in the first place? To understand why Dillon Gabriel has quietly drifted out of the picture, you have to zoom out and look at the one thing that's been driving nearly every decision inside this organization: the Deshaun Watson contract. Because this isn't just a big deal, it's the deal that's been hanging over Cleveland for years now, shaping moves, limiting flexibility, and forcing the front office into choices they probably never wanted to make in the first place. When the Browns restructured Watson's contract yet again, it wasn't some bold, creative move, it was survival. They had no choice. An $80+ million cap hit is the kind of number that doesn't just hurt your roster, it suffocates it. And when you're sitting over the cap before free agency even begins, you're not thinking about long-term experiments or development projects. You're thinking about immediate solutions. That restructure bought them breathing room, but it came at a cost. Because every time you push money into the future, you're also pushing yourself closer to an inevitable breaking point. And in this case, that breaking point is already visible. The way the contract is now structured, everything points toward 2026 being Watson's final year with the team, with a massive financial hit waiting on the other side. That's not speculation, that's the reality baked into the numbers. So from the Browns' perspective, this isn't about slowly developing multiple quarterbacks over time. This is about figuring out as quickly as possible who can actually lead this team once the Watson era officially ends. And that urgency changes everything. Because when you're operating under that kind of pressure, you don't have the luxury of spreading reps across 3 or 4 different options, hoping one of them eventually figures it out. You need clarity, you need direction, you need to start narrowing the focus to the players who actually fit what you're trying to build next, and that's exactly what we're seeing now. The attention is being funneled towards Sanders, the door is being left open for a new addition, someone who might better match the system the new coaching staff wants to run. And in the middle of all that, someone has to be squeezed out. That's where Dillon Gabriel's situation starts to make a lot more sense. It's not necessarily that he failed in some dramatic, headline-worthy way. It's that he doesn't solve the problem the Browns are trying to fix. He's not the expensive veteran they're tied to financially, and he's not the young quarterback they're actively trying to develop as the future face of the franchise. He sits in that uncomfortable middle ground, valuable enough to have some trade appeal, but not essential enough to justify keeping him in a crowded, high-stakes quarterback room. And when a team is being forced by its own financial reality to make sharp, decisive moves, those middle ground players are usually the first ones to go. At a certain point, you have to stop looking at it as a series of separate events and start seeing the pattern. Gabriel wasn't being phased out because of one bad game or one injury. He was being phased out because he didn't align with what the Browns are trying to become. He doesn't bring the upside they're chasing. He doesn't carry the investment they're tied to, and he doesn't fit the timeline they're now operating under. And in a league where every roster spot, especially at quarterback, is tied directly to future planning, that kind of misalignment is all it takes. So instead of being developed, he became something else entirely, a movable piece, a name that can be included in trade conversations, a player who still has value but not in the place he currently is. And once a quarterback reaches that stage inside an organization, the outcome is usually just a matter of timing, which raises the next obvious question. If he's no longer part of the plan, where exactly does he end up next? Once a quarterback shifts from part of the plan to movable piece, the conversation changes immediately. It's no longer about development or opportunity, it's about value, timing, and finding the right landing spot. And when you look at how Dillon Gabriel is being discussed around the league right now, that shift has clearly already happened. Reports suggest that the Browns are open to moving him, and more importantly, other teams are starting to view him exactly the way Cleveland does, as a low-risk, cost-controlled option who can fill a very specific role. Not a future starter, not a franchise reset, but a reliable backup with enough experience to step in if needed. And in today's NFL, that kind of player quietly holds real value. The expected return tells you everything you need to know about how the league views him. Most projections have his trade value sitting somewhere in the 5th to 6th round range, maybe slightly higher if multiple teams get involved. That might not sound like much, but for a young quarterback on a rookie deal with starting experience, it's actually a pretty active market tier. Teams are always looking for stability behind their starter, especially ones with injury concerns or system-specific needs. And that's where Gabriel becomes interesting, because his fit isn't universal, but in the right situation, it makes a lot of sense. One of the more talked about possibilities involves Atlanta, and this is where things start to get a little more layered. The Falcons, with a left-handed starting quarterback, would benefit from having a backup who doesn't force the entire offense to adjust if he has to step in. That's not just a minor detail. It affects protections, timing, and play design across the board. Gabriel fits that profile naturally. On top of that, there's been buzz around internal familiarity, with connections and coaching philosophy that could make the transition smoother. Nothing is confirmed, but it's the kind of move that aligns logically with what both sides need. Then you have other teams being loosely linked through speculation, organizations like Philadelphia or Indianapolis, where depth at quarterback has been an ongoing concern. In those cases, the interest isn't about upside, it's about reliability. Can this player come in, manage the offense, and keep things functional if the starter misses time? Gabriel checks enough of those boxes to at least be in the conversation. And when multiple teams are even mildly interested in that type of role, it creates just enough leverage for Cleveland to get something back instead of simply cutting ties. But here's the key detail that ties all of this together. None of these scenarios position Gabriel as anything more than a secondary piece, and that's not a knock on him, it's just the reality of how he's currently viewed. The Browns aren't fielding calls about building around him, they're fielding calls about fitting him into someone else's system. And once that becomes the market, the outcome is usually inevitable. It's not about if a move happens, it's about when the right offer lines up with Cleveland's timeline. Because at this point, holding on to him doesn't really serve a purpose anymore. Not with the direction the team is heading, and not with the changes that are clearly coming next. And that's where this situation takes another turn, because moving Dillon Gabriel isn't the end of the story, it's actually the beginning of a much bigger move that hasn't fully surfaced yet. And this is where everything starts to come into focus, because moving Dillon Gabriel isn't the headline, it's the setup. Teams don't clear out a quarterback quietly unless they already have something else lined up, or at the very least, a very clear idea of what they're about to pursue next. And in Cleveland's case, the messaging coming out of the building has been consistent on one key point.
They are not going into another season with a crowded, unfocused quarterback room. That chaos from last year, the split reps, the mixed signals, the lack of identity, that's not happening again. This time, the plan is to simplify, to narrow it down, and to bring in someone who can immediately raise the level of competition. Reports suggest the Browns are actively exploring both free agency and trade options to add another quarterback, and not just for depth. This isn't about bringing in a third-string safety net. This is about introducing a real contender, someone who can legitimately push for the starting job the moment they walk into the building. And when you combine that with the way Dillon Gabriel is being phased out, it becomes pretty clear what's happening. They're making room, not just on the roster, but in the rep distribution, in the meeting rooms, and in the overall direction of the offense. Now, one name that keeps floating around in this conversation is Justin Fields, and while nothing has been confirmed, the fit is interesting enough that it won't go away. Fields brings a completely different dimension to the position. Mobility, play extension, the ability to operate outside structure, and that aligns closely with the kind of offensive system the Browns' current coaching staff is believed to favor. On his best days, he's shown flashes of being able to take over games in ways that few quarterbacks can. The inconsistency has always been the issue, but in the right system, with the right support, there's still a belief in league circles that there's more there to unlock. And that's exactly the kind of gamble Cleveland appears to be considering. Not a safe, predictable addition, but someone who changes the dynamic the moment he arrives. Because if a player like Fields enters this room, the entire balance shifts overnight. This is no longer about slowly developing a young quarterback while managing a veteran contract in the background. This becomes a direct competition with real stakes, real urgency, and real consequences. Every rep matters. Every decision carries weight. And suddenly, the Browns are no longer stuck. They're actively choosing their future. But here's where it gets complicated. Because adding a quarterback like that doesn't just create opportunity, it creates pressure, and not evenly across the room. It forces decisions that can't be delayed, conversations that can't be avoided, and roles that can't remain undefined. Someone is going to be pushed into a corner, someone is going to lose ground, and depending on how this plays out, it might not be the player people expect. Because once that new piece arrives, the entire quarterback hierarchy in Cleveland gets tested. And when that happens, it won't just be about who fits the system best. It'll be about who the organization is truly willing to move forward with.
And once that new quarterback enters the picture, everything tightens around the one matchup the Browns can't avoid anymore. Shedeur Sanders versus Deshaun Watson. Because for all the talk about depth charts and competition, this is the real decision sitting underneath everything. On one side, you have Sanders, the young quarterback who hasn't been handed anything, but is quietly being positioned as the future. On the other, you have Watson, the massive financial commitment, the veteran name, the player the franchise has been tied to for years, whether it has worked or not. And when those two exist in the same room, especially with a new contender added to the mix, the tension isn't theoretical. It's unavoidable. Sanders represents direction, not perfection, not certainty, but direction. He's younger, cheaper, and more aligned with a timeline that actually makes sense for where the Browns are headed. The organization can develop him, shape the offense around him, and grow into something sustainable over the next few seasons. That's the long-term appeal. But the short-term reality is a lot messier. He hasn't proven enough yet to lock anything down. There were flashes, moments where you could see the potential, but also stretches where the inexperience showed. And when you're trying to win now while also planning for the future, that kind of uncertainty becomes difficult to fully commit to. Then there's Watson, and this is where the situation gets complicated in a completely different way. Because his presence isn't just about performance, it's about investment. The contract, the expectations, the years already spent trying to make it work. Even with everything pointing toward an eventual exit, he's still there, still occupying space, still demanding attention simply because of what the team has put into him. And that creates a strange dynamic where he can't just be ignored, even if the football side of things hasn't delivered what was originally hoped. You don't just move on cleanly from something that big, even when the writing is starting to appear on the wall.
Now add a new quarterback into that environment, someone brought in specifically to compete, and suddenly this isn't just a two-way conversation anymore, it's pressure from all directions. Sanders has to prove he's ready faster than expected. Watson has to show he still belongs despite everything working against him, and the newcomer is there to take advantage of any hesitation from either side. That's not a developmental setup, that's a pressure cooker. And in situations like that, decisions tend to come quickly and sometimes brutally. What makes this even more interesting is how the organization handles the optics of it all. Because publicly, this will still be framed as an open competition, as multiple players getting a fair shot, but internally, there will be a clear understanding of what each outcome means. If Sanders takes control, it signals a full commitment to the future. If Watson somehow reclaims the role, it delays that transition and keeps the current structure alive a little longer. And if the new addition rises to the top, then everything resets in a way nobody fully saw coming. Either way, someone is losing this battle. There's no scenario where all of these paths coexist peacefully, and that's why the stakes feel so high, not just for the players involved, but for the direction of the entire franchise. Because once this decision is made, it doesn't just define the quarterback room, it defines what the Browns are going to be moving forward. And even with all of that pressure building, there's still another layer to this story that makes the situation even more revealing. And while all the attention has been locked onto the quarterback room, something just as important has been quietly unfolding in the background, a full offensive reset that's almost impossible to ignore once you look at the numbers. Because no matter who ends up under center, the reality is this: the Browns' offense as it currently stands isn't built to support anyone. Not Watson, not Sanders, not any new quarterback they bring in. When your leading receiver barely clears meaningful production and your tight end ends up being your most reliable target, that's not just a bad stretch, that's a structural problem. It tells you the system isn't functioning the way it should, and more importantly, that the personnel doesn't match what the team is trying to do. And that's exactly why the conversation around Cleveland has started to shift toward playmakers. Reports suggest the front office is prioritizing wide receiver upgrades, and when you look at the names being floated, it's clear they're not thinking small. There's been buzz around a potential move for a true number one receiver, someone who doesn't just contribute, but completely changes how defenses have to approach the game. A player who can create separation, command double coverage, and open everything else up underneath. Because right now, the Browns don't have that. They have pieces, but they don't have a focal point. And without that, even a talented quarterback ends up looking limited. One of the more talked about possibilities involves a high-profile receiver potentially becoming available, with rumors suggesting that multiple teams are circling and monitoring the situation closely. Cleveland is believed to be one of those teams, especially now that they've created some financial flexibility. Nothing is confirmed, and the asking price would likely be significant, but the interest alone tells you how aggressive they're willing to be. They're not just trying to patch holes, they're trying to redefine the identity of the offense entirely. And when a team starts thinking that way, it usually means they're preparing to support a quarterback they believe in, or one they're about to bring in. There's also been speculation around younger, high-upside receivers, players still on rookie deals who haven't fully broken out yet but carry massive potential. These are the kinds of moves that don't just help immediately, but also align with a longer timeline. Pairing a developing quarterback with a young, dynamic receiver creates something you can build around for years instead of constantly trying to fix year-to-year gaps. It's a different philosophy, one that signals patience, but also confidence in the direction you're heading. And when you connect this back to the quarterback situation, it becomes even more revealing, because you don't overhaul your offensive weapons unless you're serious about making a clean transition. This isn't about squeezing one more season out of a broken system, it's about setting up the next version of the Browns' offense. Faster, more explosive, more adaptable to modern schemes. And that kind of shift doesn't happen halfway. It requires commitment, clarity, and a willingness to move on from pieces that don't fit. Which brings everything full circle. Because while fans are focused on who's throwing the ball, the organization is clearly thinking about the bigger picture, who they're building around, and what kind of offense they want to become. And once you see that, one final realization starts to hit. None of these moves were ever meant to include Dillon Gabriel in the first place. And when you step back and connect every piece, the silence, the financial pressure, the trade conversations, the incoming quarterback rumors, and now the offensive overhaul, it all points to one conclusion that's been hiding in plain sight this entire time. This was never a real competition, not in the way it was presented, and not in the way fans were led to believe, because real competitions don't erase one participant from the conversation before they even begin. Real competitions don't funnel all attention, reps in long-term planning toward a select few, while quietly pushing another name to the margins. What we've been watching isn't an open battle, it's a controlled transition.
Dillon Gabriel didn't lose a competition. He was phased out of one. And there's a difference. Losing means you were given a fair shot, that the organization invested time, energy, and belief into seeing what you could become. Being phased out means the decision was made first, and everything else that followed was just the process of getting there without making it obvious. That's why the messaging never lined up. That's why his name slowly disappeared while others became the focal point. The Browns weren't waiting to see what Gabriel would become. They had already decided what he wasn't. And the more you look at how everything has been structured, the clearer that becomes. The contract moves centered around Watson, the developmental focus centered around Sanders, the potential additions point toward a completely different style of quarterback altogether. Every path forward the Browns have explored leads somewhere that doesn't include Gabriel. And when every possible direction excludes the same player, that's not coincidence, that's intention. It's the organization quietly aligning itself with a future it's already chosen. What makes this even more telling is how cleanly the narrative has been managed. There's been no public fallout, no dramatic statements, no clear moment where the team draws a line and says this is over. Instead, it's been handled through absence, through omission, through slowly reducing his presence until the idea of him leaving feels normal instead of shocking. And that's how teams prefer to handle situations like this. Minimize the noise, control the optics, and let the decision reveal itself over time rather than all at once. Because at the end of the day, this was never about evaluating 3 quarterbacks equally. It was about buying time while the organization figured out how to pivot. And now that pivot is happening. The roster is being reshaped, the priorities are being clarified, and the direction is becoming impossible to misread. The Browns know where they're going. They've known for a while. And Dillon Gabriel was never part of that destination. Which means when the final move does happen, with his name is officially moved, traded, or quietly removed from the roster, it won't feel like a sudden decision. It'll feel like the final step in a process that's been unfolding right in front of everyone all along. And when that move finally becomes official, whether it's a late-round pick, a quiet player swap, or a deal that barely makes the national headlines, it's not going to feel like breaking news. It's going to feel like confirmation. Confirmation of everything the Browns have been signaling without actually saying. Because by the time Dillon Gabriel is gone, the real work will already be underway. The quarterback room will be reshaped, the hierarchy will be clearer, and the direction of the franchise will no longer be something you have to guess at. It'll be right there in front of you. That's what makes this moment so important, not because of the player being moved, but because of what the move represents. This is the Browns officially stepping out of that gray area they've been stuck in for years. No more juggling timelines, no more trying to balance a past investment with a future possibility. This is a decision point. A line in the sand that says they're ready to commit to what comes next, even if that means accepting the cost of what came before. And whether that future is built around Shedeur Sanders, a new arrival, or some unexpected twist that hasn't fully revealed itself yet, one thing is clear: they're done pretending they have all the answers sitting in the same room. Because the truth is, you can only delay clarity for so long in the NFL. Eventually, the pressure forces you to choose. It forces you to prioritize one path over another, one identity over another. And every move Cleveland has made, from the contract restructuring to the shifting media narrative to the players they're targeting, has been leading to this exact point, the moment where the quiet signals turn into real action. So when Dillon Gabriel is no longer part of this roster, don't look at it as the Browns giving up on a young quarterback. Look at it as the Browns finally revealing what they've believed all along.
that the future of this team was never going to be built around him, that the competition everyone thought they were watching was never truly open, and that everything happening right now has been part of a much bigger reset taking place behind the scenes. Because in the end, this move isn't about who's leaving, it's about who they've already chosen.